"You left me for a janitor," my ex-husband Richard said loudly across the Christmas dinner table, lifting his glass as if he had just delivered the cleverest joke in the world. And for a moment the entire room went silent before the laughter started, soft at first, then louder, rolling around the table like it belonged there among the candles and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. And I felt my hands freeze around my fork as every pair of eyes turned toward the man sitting beside me. Daniel Brooks, the man I had asked to marry me just 3 months earlier, the man my family had never met until tonight, the man they now saw only as the punchline to Richard's cruel little performance. I had spent the entire afternoon worrying about this dinner, standing in my small kitchen, wrapping a pecan pie in foil, and telling myself that Christmas was supposed to bring people together, that even after the divorce, even after all the awkward years that followed, maybe this year could be different. Maybe this year my children would finally see that I had found someone kind, someone patient, someone who didn't measure people by their bank accounts or job titles the way Richard always had. When Daniel picked me up that evening, the air outside was cold enough to make my breath visible, and he held the passenger door open like he always did, smiling that quiet smile that first made me trust him months ago when we met at the community center where he worked maintenance. And as we drove the 15 miles across town to my daughter Emily's house, the streets glowing with Christmas lights and inflatable snowmen in every yard, I kept smoothing the fabric of my sweater and rehearsing introductions in my head like a nervous teenager meeting her boyfriend's parents for the first time. Emily's house was bright when we arrived, music drifting out the front door and the windows fogged from the heat of too many people inside. And Daniel squeezed my hand once before we walked in. Together, a simple gesture that steadied my nerves more than any speech could have. But the moment Richard saw us standing in the doorway, his eyebrows lifted in that familiar way I remembered from 20 years of marriage. The look that always meant trouble was coming. Introductions happened quickly. Plates were filled, glasses were passed around, and for a few minutes everything almost felt normal, until Richard leaned back in his chair, looked Daniel up and down like a critic inspecting a cheap painting, and asked in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear what exactly Daniel did for a living. And Daniel answered calmly, "I take care of the building at the community center," which was the honest truth, though it clearly wasn't the answer Richard had hoped for, because that was when the smile spread across his face, and he lifted his glass again and delivered the line that made the entire table erupt. "You left me for a janitor?" And suddenly even my son Tyler was laughing, shaking his head like the situation was some unbelievable comedy. And Emily covered her mouth, but didn't stop smiling, and I stood there in the middle of my own family's Christmas dinner, feeling something inside my chest crack quietly, the kind of quiet break that no one else hears. I turned toward Daniel, expecting embarrassment, maybe anger, maybe the same hurt that was burning in my own chest, but instead he simply looked around the table with that same calm expression he had worn all evening. Then he smiled, not nervously, not defensively, just a small, steady smile, the kind of smile a person gives when they understand something that everyone else in the room has completely missed. The laughter lingered in the air longer than it should have, bouncing gently off the walls decorated with red ribbons and evergreen garlands, as if the room itself had decided the joke was worth repeating. And I could feel the heat rising in my face while I kept my eyes on my plate, carefully pressing my fork into a slice of turkey that suddenly felt impossible to swallow. Because the sound of my children laughing was not something I had prepared for. Not tonight, not on Christmas, not when I had spent the entire drive over hoping that this dinner might be the beginning of something better. Emily eventually cleared her throat and tried to smooth the moment away by asking if anyone wanted more mashed potatoes. But the damage had already settled quietly into my chest, the same way snow settles on a quiet street after midnight, soft but heavy enough to change the shape of everything. And Richard leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had just proven a point. I remembered that posture well from the years we were married, the way he always seemed proudest when he had managed to put someone else in their place. And for a moment, I felt the old familiar instinct to defend myself, to explain that Daniel was not just a job title, that kindness and dignity mattered more than any corner office or luxury car. But the words never made it to my mouth because Daniel reached calmly for his glass of water, and took a quiet sip as if nothing unusual had happened. He did not rush to correct Richard. He did not argue. He did not even look offended, and that strange calmness only made the room feel more uncomfortable, because without anger to push against, Richard's joke simply hung there in the air like a decoration that no one knew how to take down. Tyler finally shook his head and said that life was full of surprises, the kind of half-joking comment people make when they want to keep the mood light without actually apologizing. And Emily gave me a small, sympathetic smile that felt more like pity than support, and I suddenly realized how far away my own children had drifted over the years, how easily they had learned to see the world through their father's lens, where success meant square footage and job titles, and anything less was quietly dismissed. Across the table, Daniel set his glass down with steady hands and looked toward Richard with a polite expression that almost seemed curious rather than defensive. And when he spoke, his voice was calm and even, the way someone speaks when they're not in a hurry to prove anything to anyone. And he simply said that taking care of a building meant making sure the people inside it felt safe and comfortable every day, which was work he happened to enjoy. Richard chuckled again at that, clearly convinced he had already won whatever invisible contest he thought this dinner represented. But I noticed something in Daniel's eyes then. Not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter and harder to define, like the calm surface of a lake that hides a much deeper current underneath, and for reasons I could not quite explain, the tight knot of humiliation. And my chest loosened just slightly as I realized that Daniel was not smiling because he was trying to endure the moment. He was smiling because he already understood something about this situation that the rest of us had not yet discovered. The room slowly drifted back into conversation, but the warmth that usually filled Emily's dining room during Christmas dinner felt thinner now. Like the heat from the fireplace was no longer strong enough to reach every corner, and I noticed how the glow of the tree lights reflected softly in the window beside the table, while snow had begun falling outside, covering the quiet suburban street in a thin white layer that made everything look peaceful from a distance, which felt strangely different from the tension sitting quietly between us at the table. Emily began passing around the green bean casserole, while Tyler talked about a new project at work, and the conversation moved forward as if everyone had silently agreed to pretend nothing uncomfortable had happened. But I could still feel Richard watching Daniel with the same amused expression he used whenever he believed he had already figured someone out. That was always his favorite game, deciding who mattered and who did. Not within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. And during our marriage, he had played that game everywhere from charity events to neighborhood barbecues, always certain that his expensive watch and large house proved something important about his place in the world. Daniel, however, did not seem interested in playing that game at all, and instead he asked Emily about the house she and her husband had recently bought, complimenting the way the dining room had been decorated with small glass ornaments and red candles that made the entire table glow softly, and Emily relaxed slightly when she realized the conversation had shifted away from the earlier embarrassment. For a while, the evening almost regained its rhythm. The quiet clinking of silverware, the low murmur of voices, the occasional laugh that felt safer than the first one had been. But every so often I caught Richard glancing toward Daniel with a faint smirk of someone waiting for another opportunity to make a point. Finally, he leaned forward again and asked how long Daniel had been working at the community center, his voice polite on the surface, but carrying the same subtle edge underneath. And Daniel answered without hesitation that he had been there for several years, and that he enjoyed the work because it allowed him to help keep the place running for families and children who depended on it every day. Tyler nodded slowly at that, as if he was not quite sure what to say, and Richard gave a short laugh that sounded more like disbelief than humor, remarking that it must be a simple life, not having to worry about board meetings or quarterly reports. And I felt the familiar pressure building behind my ribs again, the same quiet frustration I had lived with for decades when Richard reduced people's lives to a comparison chart of income and status. But Daniel did not respond with irritation or embarrassment. He simply folded his hands calmly on the table and looked at Richard with the same steady expression he had worn since the beginning of the evening. And something about that calmness seemed to unsettle Richard more than any argument could have. because people who measure. The world in terms of winners and losers usually expect their opponents to react in predictable ways, and Daniel was giving him nothing to push against. The candles flickered slightly as someone opened the kitchen door to bring in a fresh tray of rolls, and in that quiet moment, I noticed again the strange patience in Daniel's smile, the kind of patience that comes from someone who is not worried about how the story will end. And for the first time that night, I found myself wondering if perhaps Daniel was not simply enduring this dinner the way I had assumed, but instead waiting calmly for something that had not happened yet, something that would eventually change the way everyone at this table saw him. The dinner plates were slowly clearing as the evening moved forward, and the gentle clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen mixed with the quiet hum of holiday music playing somewhere in the background, the kind of soft instrumental songs that were supposed to make everything feel warm and nostalgic. Yet the atmosphere around the table still carried a thin layer of tension that no one seemed willing to acknowledge directly. Emily stood up to bring dessert, while Tyler began talking about the snowfall outside, mentioning that the forecast said the storm could drop 3 or 4 inches before morning, which meant the streets might be quiet and white by sunrise. And for a moment the conversation drifted towards safer topics like weather and travel plans, the kind of polite small talk people use when they're trying to repair a mood that has already been damaged. Daniel remained calm beside me, occasionally nodding as someone spoke and thanking Emily when she placed a slice of pie in front of him, his voice steady and warm in a way that made him seem completely unaffected by everything that had happened earlier. And I realized that this was exactly the same quiet composure he had shown the first day I met him months ago at the community center, when I had walked in carrying 2 heavy boxes of donated books, and he had stepped forward without hesitation to help me carry them across the hallway. I remember that afternoon clearly because the building had smelled faintly of floor polish and fresh coffee, and Daniel had greeted everyone who passed through the lobby with the same calm friendliness he showed tonight, whether it was a volunteer, a teacher, or a group of children running through the hallway after an after-school program. At the time, I had simply thought he was a thoughtful man doing honest work, someone who seemed to understand the value of small kindnesses that often go unnoticed. And over the following weeks, our conversations had grown naturally, first about the events happening at the center, then about books, music, and the quiet routines that fill ordinary days. And never once had he spoken about himself in a way that sounded boastful or defensive. Sitting at the dinner table now, watching him listen politely while Richard continued to guide the conversation toward business success and investment returns, I suddenly realized how different the two men were in ways that had nothing to do with money or job titles. Because Richard always filled a room with his presence, while Daniel somehow made a room feel calmer simply by being in it. Richard eventually leaned back again and mentioned a new development project happening downtown, describing the office towers and luxury apartments that were supposed to change the skyline within the next few years. And while he spoke, he glanced toward Daniel, as if expecting another reaction, perhaps another opportunity to remind everyone at the table that he belonged to a different world than the man sitting beside me. Daniel listened quietly, then gave a small nod of appreciation as if the story itself was interesting, not the prestige attached to it. And for a brief moment, I noticed Richard's confident expression falter slightly, the way it sometimes does when someone realizes their usual methods are not producing the expected results. The candles continued flickering gently in the center of the table, casting soft shadows across the faces around us. And while everyone else seemed focused on finishing dessert or discussing the snowstorm outside, I kept noticing the same steady calm in Daniel's posture, the same patient smile that had been there since the beginning of the evening. And deep down, I began to sense that the quiet confidence he carried was not the confidence of someone trying to prove himself, but the confidence of someone who already knew exactly who he was, regardless of whether anyone else at this table understood it yet. The plates were nearly empty now, and the warm scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the dining room, as Emily placed a second pot of coffee on the table, trying to restore the comfortable rhythm that Christmas dinners were supposed to have. And for a few minutes, the conversation drifted toward ordinary things like travel plans for the new year and the snowfall that continued quietly outside the windows. but I could still feel the subtle current of judgment lingering beneath the polite smiles. Around the table, the same unspoken question sitting in the room like a guest no one had invited, yet no one could ignore. Richard seemed especially determined to keep the focus on success and achievement, speaking at length about market trends and real estate prices, as if every sentence was another reminder of the world he believed mattered most. And each time he spoke, he glanced toward Daniel with that familiar look I remembered from our marriage, the look that silently asked whether the person listening could possibly measure up. Daniel listened with the same patient attention he gave everyone, occasionally nodding or asking a thoughtful question that showed he had heard every detail, and it struck me again how different his presence felt compared to the constant tension that had filled so many dinners during my years with Richard. When every conversation eventually turned into some quiet competition of status and accomplishments. Tyler eventually asked Daniel how long he planned to stay at the community center, his tone curious but cautious, as if he was still unsure what to make of the man sitting across from him. And Daniel answered that he had been there long enough to see the place grow into something important for the neighborhood, explaining how after-school programs and community events kept the building busy nearly every evening of the week. Emily nodded politely at that, though I could tell from the way she shifted in her chair that she was still adjusting to the idea of her mother choosing a life that looked so different from the one she had known growing up, when business dinners and country club events had once been normal parts of our calendar. Richard chuckled quietly and commented that it must be refreshing to live without the pressure of boardrooms or corporate deadlines. And the remark carried that same subtle edge that had shaped so many conversations during our marriage, the suggestion that some lives simply mattered more than others depending on the size of their responsibilities. Daniel did not react defensively to the comment. He only smiled again with that same calm composure and said that every job carried its own kind of responsibility, especially when people depended on you to keep things running smoothly, and his voice carried the kind of quiet certainty that does not need to raise itself to be heard. For a moment the room grew slightly quieter after he said that, and even Richard seemed unsure how to respond, because Daniel had answered without irritation and without apology, leaving no clear opening for another joke. Outside the window, the snow continued falling steadily under the glow of the streetlights, covering the neighborhood in a soft white layer that made everything look peaceful and still, and while everyone else returned to their coffee and dessert. I found myself studying Daniel's expression once more, noticing again the strange, calm confidence in the way he sat there listening to the conversation unfold. It was the confidence of someone who was not worried about how he was being judged, someone who understood that the truth about a person rarely appears in the first impression others choose to make. And as the quiet murmur of voices continued around the table, I began to sense more strongly than before that Daniel was not simply enduring this evening out of politeness for my sake, but patiently allowing everyone in the room to reveal exactly what they believed about worth and dignity before the rest of the story finally revealed itself. The evening continued to move forward with the slow rhythm that holiday dinners often have once the main meal is finished, the kind of quiet stretch of time when coffee cups replace dinner plates and conversations soften into smaller circles around the table. Yet I could still feel the weight of the earlier remarks lingering beneath the polite atmosphere, like a faint echo that had not fully disappeared. Emily began clearing the dessert plates, while Tyler stepped away for a moment to check the snowfall through the front window, announcing that the driveway was already covered with several inches of fresh snow, the streetlights reflecting off the white surface and making the entire neighborhood look calm and untouched. And for a brief moment the room seemed to settle into a peaceful silence, broken only by the low hum of the heater and the soft instrumental music still playing from the living room. Richard, however, seemed unwilling to let the evening end without one more attempt to reinforce the point he believed he had already made earlier. And as he stirred sugar slowly into his coffee, he turned once again toward Daniel with a thin smile and asked whether working maintenance at the community center paid enough to keep up with the rising cost of living in the city. The question framed casually, but carrying the same quiet condescension that had shaped so many conversations during our marriage. I felt the familiar tension rise inside me again, the instinct to defend the man sitting beside me before the conversation turned cruel once more. But Daniel simply rested his hands calmly around his coffee mug and answered in the same steady tone he had used all evening, explaining that the work itself was meaningful to him because the building served hundreds of families every week, and keeping it running smoothly allowed children to attend after-school programs and local residents to gather for community events that might not exist otherwise. His explanation was simple and sincere, yet something about the calm certainty in his voice made the room fall briefly quiet again, because Daniel spoke as if the value of his work had never been measured by the size of a paycheck or the title printed on a business card. Richard let out a short laugh and leaned back again in his chair, clearly amused by what he considered a modest ambition, and he began describing another real estate venture he had recently invested in downtown, outlining the size of the new development and the millions of dollars projected to move through the project over the next few years, speaking loudly enough that everyone at the table could hear the numbers. As if they were proof of something undeniable, Daniel listened with quiet attention, occasionally nodding as if the details themselves were interesting rather than impressive, and for the first time that evening I noticed a faint crease appear between Richard's eyebrows, the subtle expression of someone who expected admiration and instead received calm indifference. Emily returned to the table, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, and began pouring refills, perhaps hoping that warm cups and casual conversation might finally soften the tension that still hovered around us. But while the others discussed the snowstorm and travel delays that might come with it, I found myself studying Daniel's expression again and realizing that the calm smile he carried had not changed once during the entire evening. It was not the smile of someone trying to endure an uncomfortable moment, nor the forced politeness of someone eager to be accepted. It was the quiet composure of a person who already understood the difference between the way people present themselves to the world and the truth that eventually reveals who they really are. And as the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflected in the window beside us, I sensed more clearly than ever that Daniel was not concerned with winning an argument at this table, because whatever he knew about himself and about the evening unfolding around us was something far more patient than pride and far more steady than embarrassment. And somewhere beneath the gentle sounds of conversation and falling snow, I began to feel that the real turning point of this night had not happened yet, but was quietly approaching with the same calm certainty that Daniel seemed to carry with him wherever he went. The quiet rhythm of the evening continued as the last of the coffee was poured and the candles in the center of the table burned lower, their small flames flickering gently each time someone moved or shifted in their chair. And outside the window the snow had begun to fall more heavily, covering the neighborhood in a thicker white blanket that softened the glow of the streetlights and made the world beyond the glass feel distant and still. Inside the dining room the conversation moved slowly from one topic to another, but I could sense that everyone was aware of the tension that had never fully disappeared, the way a room feels after a storm has passed, but the air still carries the memory of thunder. Richard seemed especially restless now, as though the calm way Daniel had responded all evening had somehow unsettled him more than any argument would have. And after another sip of coffee, he leaned forward once again with the confident posture I remembered so well from the years we were married, the posture of a man preparing to prove a point he believed was obvious. He asked Daniel whether he had ever considered doing something more ambitious with his life, something that might offer real financial growth instead of the quiet routine of maintenance work. And the question carried the same polite tone that people often use when they are disguising criticism as advice. For a moment the room grew quiet again. Emily paused while collecting a stack of plates, and Tyler looked from Richard to Daniel, as if unsure whether another uncomfortable moment was about to unfold. But Daniel only rested his hands calmly on the edge of the table and answered that he had spent most of his life believing that work should create stability for the people around it, not just profit for the person doing it, and his voice carried the same gentle certainty that had been present all evening. Richard gave a short laugh and shook his head slightly, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. And he began describing once again the kind of success he believed defined a meaningful career, speaking about office towers and investment portfolios as though they were the only measurements that mattered in the world. Daniel listened patiently, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive, and when Richard finished, he simply nodded and thanked him for sharing the perspective, the same way someone might respond to a story rather than challenge. And that quiet response seemed to confuse Richard more than anger ever could. At that moment, Tyler returned from the front hallway, where he had stepped out to check the driveway, brushing snow from his jacket and mentioning that the snowfall had already reached several inches and was still coming down steadily. And while everyone briefly turned their attention to the weather and the possibility that roads might be difficult by morning, I noticed something small but unexpected happen across the table. One of Richard's old business acquaintances, a man who had been invited to dinner at the last minute after a holiday gathering nearby, had been watching Daniel carefully for several minutes with a puzzled expression, the kind of look people have when a memory is just beginning to surface but has not yet fully arrived. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying Daniel's face more closely, and although he did not say anything right away, I could see the moment of recognition forming slowly behind his eyes. Daniel seemed to notice the look as well, but remained completely calm, offering the same polite smile he had given everyone else throughout the evening. And as the snow continued falling quietly outside the window and the candles burned lower on the table, I sensed that something in the room was beginning to shift, not loudly or dramatically, but in the subtle way that truth sometimes appears when people finally begin to look more carefully at the person they thought they had already understood. The quiet pause that followed lingered for several seconds longer than anyone expected, the kind of pause that slowly spreads across a room when someone is trying to remember something important but cannot quite place it yet. And I watched as the man across the table leaned slightly forward in his chair, while continuing to study Daniel's face with a growing sense of recognition. The candles flickered gently between them, their light reflecting in the glass of the dining room cabinet. And outside the window, the snow continued falling steadily, the soft white flakes drifting through the glow of the streetlights in a way that made the world beyond the house look calm and distant. Inside, however, the atmosphere had begun to shift in a way that was impossible to ignore, because the puzzled expression on the man's face was slowly transforming into something closer to certainty. Finally, he set his coffee cup down carefully and spoke in a thoughtful voice that immediately drew everyone's attention, asking Daniel if they might have met before at a conference several years ago in Chicago, mentioning a large development summit that had brought together investors and city planners from across the country. Richard looked confused by the question and gave a small dismissive laugh, as if the idea itself was absurd. But Daniel simply tilted his head slightly as he considered the memory, and then answered calmly that he had indeed attended that conference, though it had been quite some time ago. The man's eyes widened slightly at the confirmation, and he leaned back in his chair with a soft exhale of surprise before explaining to the rest of the table that the name Daniel Brooks sounded familiar, because he had once followed a major housing initiative connected to that name, a project that had gained national attention for creating affordable developments in several cities while still maintaining profitable investments for the communities involved. Emily stopped stacking plates, and Tyler looked up with sudden curiosity, clearly unsure where the conversation was going, while Richard's confident smile faded into a puzzled expression as he tried to follow the unexpected direction of the discussion. The man continued slowly, as though piecing together the memory out loud, saying that if he remembered correctly, the Daniel Brooks connected to those projects had been the founder of a company that specialized in urban redevelopment and community housing partnerships, the kind of work that required enormous coordination between investors, city governments, and neighborhood organizations. The room grew noticeably quieter after that, the earlier laughter and casual conversation replaced by a stillness that made the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall suddenly easier to hear. Daniel remained seated calmly beside me, his expression unchanged except for the same gentle smile he had carried throughout the evening. And when Tyler finally asked in a cautious voice whether that Daniel Brooks might somehow be the same person sitting at the table now, Daniel gave a small nod and answered that he had once been involved in that line of work before choosing to step away from the corporate side of the industry several years earlier. No one spoke for a moment after that, and I could feel the shift ripple quietly through the room as the meaning of his words began settling into everyone's thoughts, because the calm man they had spent the entire evening judging by his current job had just revealed a past that none of them had even considered possible. And while the snow continued falling peacefully outside the window, the silence inside the dining room grew heavier with the realization that the story they thought they understood had only just begun to reveal its truth. For several long seconds, no one at the table spoke, and the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, as if time itself had paused to let the meaning of Daniel's words settle over everyone sitting there. Richard was the first to shift in his chair, the confident posture he had carried all evening slowly giving way to a stiff uncertainty that looked unfamiliar on his face. And he cleared his throat before letting out a small laugh that sounded far less certain than the ones earlier in the night, as though he was searching for a way to return the evening to the simple joke he had started hours before. Tyler looked between Daniel and the man who had recognized his name, his expression no longer amused but thoughtful in a way that made him seem younger than he had earlier that evening. And Emily remained standing beside the table, holding a stack of dishes she had forgotten to carry into the kitchen. Daniel, however, appeared, completely unchanged by the sudden attention, resting his hands calmly on the table and speaking in the same steady voice he had used since the beginning of the dinner, explaining that several years earlier he had helped start a company that focused on building housing developments designed to balance investment with community stability, and that after many years of running projects across several cities, he had eventually stepped away from the corporate side of the industry because he wanted to spend more time seeing the real effect those buildings had on the neighborhoods they were meant to serve. He described how working at the community center allowed him to stay close to the people who actually used those spaces every day, watching children arrive for after-school programs and families gather for local events that might not exist without places like that building being maintained properly. And the quiet sincerity in his explanation carried none of the pride or defensiveness that Richard had expected earlier in the evening. Outside the window, the snowfall continued to cover the neighborhood in a calm white silence. And inside the room, the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore because the man who had spent the entire dinner being treated like a punchline had revealed a history far more substantial than anyone at the table had imagined. Richard stared at his coffee for a moment before finally looking up again, and the confident smile he had worn earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the uneasy expression of someone realizing that the assumptions guiding his earlier jokes had been far less accurate than he believed. Emily slowly set the dishes down and returned to her seat, her voice quieter when she asked Daniel why he had never mentioned any of this before. And Daniel answered simply that a person's past achievements did not need to introduce them at every dinner table, because the way someone treats people in the present usually tells a far more honest story. No one laughed after that, and the earlier tension dissolved into a thoughtful silence that felt very different from the uncomfortable one that had filled the room before, because now the quiet carried the weight of recognition. I sat beside Daniel, feeling the warmth of his calm presence, and realized that the humiliation I had felt hours earlier had quietly transformed into something steadier and stronger, the quiet dignity that comes when truth reveals itself without anger or spectacle. And as the candles burned lower and the snow continued falling softly outside the windows, it became clear that the real lesson of the evening had never belonged to Daniel at all, but to everyone who had decided they already understood his worth before they had taken the time to see who he truly was.